Hello. Welcome to Pluralsight's IT Ops News and Talk. I'm Don Jones, Curriculum Director for IT Ops Content, and this is our show for February 2016. Let's start with a bit of recent industry news. One of the biggest stories this past month was VMware's unexpected layoff of hundreds of employees. This is probably a good time to recap what's been happening with poor VMware. As you probably know, Dell is spending $67 billion to acquire EMC, which means Dell owns VMware, right? Well, no. EMC only ever owned 80% of VMware, which is a lot, but it isn't 100%. VMware continued to operate as a separate entity, complete with its own board and its own stock. EMC and VMware were in an agreement to form a joint entity named Virtustream. That happened after the Dell acquisition was on the table and would have been formed from a separate $1.2 billion acquisition EMC had already made. Although VMware and EMC would have owned Virtustream 50-50, its financial results would have been reported on VMware's books. This past December, though, VMware announced it was walking away from the Virtustream deal. To be fair, VMware's shareholders, the 20% who weren't EMC, were never really nuts about the Dell deal to begin with, and VMware's stock had sunk from around $82 to around $55 through December. That, combined with a really oddball acquisition strategy on Dell's part, probably killed the Virtustream deal. And now, VMware has laid off hundreds of employees, including its entire development teams for VMware Workstation and Fusion on the Mac. It's also parted ways with a significant chunk of its vCloud Air team, which had already been scaled back once, suggesting that VMware's cloud ambitions are getting to be a little bit more moderate. So, what does this mean for Fusion and Workstation? Probably not much. You can argue that they were already pretty feature complete and just need the odd compatibility update now and then. And you've also got commercial solutions like VirtualBox from Oracle and Parallels as options. Plus, Windows 10 includes Hyper-V, which may have been denting VMware Workstation sales. I'm personally a little pessimistic about VMware's future, given that their empire is built not on an operating system, but on a hypervisor and the management tools around it. As new forms of scale, like containers, start to go mainstream, the hypervisor could start looking a little niche in the next 10 years, which has got to worry the big V. Speaking of containers, Docker has bought unikernel systems in a move to further bolster the company's container business. Now, Docker isn't an OS, obviously. They rely instead on a Linux host OS and soon will work with a Windows host OS. But a unikernel, as they're called, is more like a mini OS. Rather than depending heavily on a host OS, with minor differences included in the container, a unikernel provides more of an entire OS with less dependency on the host. That can make it easier to move workloads around reliably and is another arrow in Docker's quiver. And now, an obituary, as Oracle has announced the retirement of the Java browser plugin, effective with the next version of the Java Development Kit, or JDK. The plugin-free Java Web Start is the official alternative and has been available since JDK 7. It does, however, require applet migration, and it doesn't run natively in a browser, but rather in its own window using the standard Java runtime. It's basically a click to launch sort of thing. Goodbye, Java browser plugin. And lastly, before I bring in this month's guests, I want to call your attention to some important security alerts. cPanel, one of the most popular web hosting account management tools, announced that some user databases may have been compromised by attackers. If you or your organization have hosting plans that use cPanel for management, listen up, because the information compromised can include names, contact info, and encrypted salted passwords. Expect to log in and change your password at least. Microsoft issued 570 patches in 2015, most of which affected Internet Explorer. So it's time to accelerate getting off that dinosaur, and especially to start moving to server core on your servers, which doesn't include IE. And because we just never talk about printers on this show, researcher Chris Vickery says he's found ways for misconfigured Office printers, which often include gigs of onboard storage, to be used as storage repositories by bad actors. His focus was on HP printers, which use port 9100 for access and basically act as a free, anonymous FTP server. All the more reason to firewall segment your LAN, so these things don't end up becoming repositories or staging points for malware. HP recommends disabling the PJL PS file system commands to prevent this problem, and Chris says that the problem is not necessarily limited to just the HP brand, so it's worth reading up on your printer's particular vulnerabilities in this area. Joining me next is Jason Alba. Jason's a Pluralsight author who has been producing a lot of courses that you maybe haven't run across in our library. They're in a section that we call professional development, and that's what we're here to talk about. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, one of the biggest things we hear from IT people all the time is it's really hard to keep up with technology. We know that a lot of our subscribers spend, 10 or more hours a month just trying to keep up with technology. So why would they maybe spend a little bit of that time on something other than technology? What are some of the reasons that this professional development stuff should kind of be on their radar?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know how hard it is to stay up with technology because I got phased out of technology. I remember sitting in a meeting where I realized that I wasn't the technologist anymore. But I've been in plenty of meetings with IT people in a management position, in a board capacity, as a customer, and also as the IT technician. And I've seen people kind of lose a conversation, not because of what they knew or didn't know, but because really of their soft skills, the way they communicated, the way they connected with other people in the room. And I think it's just really important that we complement what our technical abilities are with our ability to actually sell ourselves or sell the product or just create some sense of trust with the other people that we're communicating with.
So we're not just technical cogs in a technical machine. We're also people. I think that's a theme that I've kind of covered with people a little bit too. And you can tell me if this kind of fits. But you're not just your job. You are also your career, which might involve more than your current job. And you've kind of got to make sure that you're thinking about that. And maybe I guess that's even with the same company. You've done even some courses on career management and kind of working the corporate ladder a little bit. Tell me a little bit about how this professional development stuff can not only benefit your current job, but maybe facilitate a promotion.
Well, yeah, hopefully it'll facilitate a promotion. Honestly, in today's world, the way that job security has become redefined, I think a lot of people are just hoping to keep their jobs. I heard a statistic a number of years ago that we change jobs every 2 to 5 years. And when I first heard that, I thought it was pretty cool because I thought, well, I don't want to stay in a job longer. I want to keep getting promoted. And that's what happened the first few times. And then I completely lost my job, and I was in my first job search that I hadn't planned. And it was really a painful place to be in. I've talked to people who have been in middle to senior management or senior technologists at their organizations, and everybody kind of knows. It's kind of like the pink elephant in the room. Everybody knows that there isn't necessarily job security. No matter the industry, size of company, how great the company is doing, you never know if you're going to be there in 1 to 3 years from now. So here's kind of my overall big take on this. As a manager, I assume that you have a certain level of technical proficiency. Like, that's just an assumption. And if I interview people for a new job and I'm down to my last 3 to 5 people that I'm interviewing, they will all have a certain level of technical proficiency. Beyond that, it's whether I want to work with them, whether I would be proud, whether I would feel confident putting them in front of customers, and that could be internal or external customers. So beyond what you bring to the table, aside from your technical chops, I'm really looking at the whole you and trying to figure out if you're going to be an asset to my team or if you're going to be kind of cancerous and kind of ruin the morale and all of the stuff that I've been trying to build on my team. That almost becomes more important than whether you can do this particular function or job or not, because I can teach some of the technical stuff. I could probably teach a lot of the technical stuff, especially with resources like Pluralsight, but some of that the interpersonal skills and the soft skills, those are harder to teach.
Now, you've done a lot of things that are designed to kind of help someone be more valuable and do better in their current job too. You finished up a two-parter on being a better mentor and being a better mentee. I believe you've done a course on better working on a team as well as just some kind of prioritizing your time and tasks and managing your time type of thing. Tell me how that's something that could really benefit just about any kind of professional.
Well, I think nowadays we're going to be on teams. We're going to be in a situation where we have a whole lot of things to do, and we have to decide what the priorities are. And at the end of the day, we have so much autonomy. Whether we're on a team, whether in a big company or small company, we can really decide how we're going to run our schedule and who we interact with and how we interact with them and stuff like that. If we make good choices as far as what we work on and how we communicate with others and how we listen to others and how we participate in meetings and all of those things, people are going to notice that. Like I said, the technical stuff is a given. People, a lot of times what I've seen is there's a lot of stereotypes in IT with developers or sysadmins or whatever. There's all kinds of stereotypes. And let me give you an example of myself. I've been told over the years since I started my own company, people say, man, I really didn't think that a programmer would be able to start or run a business. And I thought that was really interesting because I'm looking at myself as a whole person and I know what my strengths and weaknesses are. But when people find out that I used to be a developer, they automatically stereotype me and put me into some kind of brand or some kind of bucket, assuming, for example, that I'm not really good with people, that I'm not going to be able to get up on a stage and talk. There's all these assumptions that I've had to break through, and that a lot of that has really had to do with how I interact with other people.
So you know how the average corporate employee kind of reacts when they're sent to sensitivity training or diversity training or whatever it is. I mean, we all know there's a valuable things, and we all know it's extremely important. We get that, but at the same time, it's like, we have to do sensitivity training again.
Yeah.
How does this professional development stuff? How should someone think differently about this? That this is something that's maybe more important to you and less so your employer.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember at one organization, a government organization that I was with, we were compelled. We had to go to those meetings, and it wasn't about whether you learned anything or not. It was just being compliant that you sat in a 1 hour or a 4 hour training or whatever it was. That when we're talking about professional development, I think the whole model of education has shifted. So, for example, if somebody tells me they want to be a developer, I say, go get a Pluralsight subscription because you're going to get the best and deepest and most current training from there, as opposed to getting a CS degree. And I'm not down on universities or college or whatever, but I remember when I was taking my programming courses, somebody made the comment that the version of Visual Basic that we were learning was already 3 or 4 years outdated.
Ouch.
Well, carry that over to the professional development world. Whenever I've had to go to any of those classes, it was kind of okay, here's a whole bunch of people in the room that don't want to be here. We don't see how this is necessarily applicable to us. And I have a whole lot of other things that I really need to do. I got deadlines. I have other things weighing on my mind. This isn't fun. It's not my choice. So there's a big difference between that and stepping back and saying, okay, in order to get to where I want to be this year or in the next 3 to 5 years or whatever, what are the things that I need to do? And you can easily break those down into the technical things that you want to learn. But you can also say, you know what? This is really hard to admit, but I know that I'm not a good listener, or I know that I come across abrasive, or something that has to do with a soft skill. When you're looking at where you're going to be in 1 or 3 or 5 years, and you're thinking, how can I improve so that I can really work towards or get the things that I want out of my career, it's a completely different reason than being compelled to go sit in an auditorium with a bunch of other people that don't want to be there.
Now, you've also done a number of courses. Well, I actually, looking at the list, I was going to say that are Kind to Management 101, but that's actually literally the name of one of the courses that are a little bit about getting started in maybe not management, but leadership. So I guess I kind of think of somebody's career or their job as a little bit of a life cycle. You get the job, that's great. You start the job, you kind of learn to work with your colleagues, but at some point, many people do want to start moving up the chain. What are some of the just quick highlights that you try to teach someone in that Management 101 type of course?
So let me just differentiate real quick between the two courses. One is Leadership Getting Started, which is more on vision and strategy. And then there's the Management 101. And what I really wanted to help people do is understand that if they do want to go the management route, and some people do think they do, and then they get there and they're like, man, this is horrible, get me out of here. There's a whole new set of skills and knowledge that you should have. So for example, as a developer, I never had to think about P&L, profit and loss, or financials. But when I became a manager, I all of a sudden had this monthly sheet that I was staring at, looking at all these figures that kind of made sense to me. They were kind of intuitive, but there were certain things that I had to go to the controller or the accountant and say, okay, this doesn't make sense. Why is this? And then she would explain in her controller way, well, actually, this is how the numbers work, and this is why it's all very logical. So there are a number of things that we can intuitively jump into as far as management goes, but there are simply a lot of things that we've never had exposure to. And so that's what the Management 101 course is. It's an introduction to a lot of the things that you would be faced with if you're a manager, how to manage people and personnel issues, as well as how to manage operations and scheduling and all of those other things that you really have never had to think about before you became a manager.
And I guess the last thing I want to hit is, and this is a smaller section of our courses, but you've done several in this area, and I know it's one of particular professional interest to you. And that's for the time when you finally do have to go find that new job. Maybe you've been laid off or you've been fired, or you've just decided it's time to move on. And tell me a little bit about how you approach that talking to people about becoming and being a job seeker.
Well, it's pretty easy. Most of the time people approach me because there are so many people who have found that there is no such thing as a 20 or 40-year career anymore. People are in transition pretty regularly. And so the first thing that I do when somebody says they lost their job or they got laid off or whatever is I say, hey, congratulations, because this really could be the start of something great for you. And you might have been in some kind of rut at your old company, and this is a great time for a fresh start. And so it's a time to do a little bit of introspection. You can start to look at different industries or different companies that you never really have thought about before. So it really is an exciting time. When I do my presentations, my in-person presentations on career management, it really breaks down to two different things. They're just two main things. One is networking. And I know that's kind of like a four-letter word for a lot of people. They're like, I don't want to go to network. And it seems very superficial. And it was hard for me to network. I thought networking was a numbers game where I had to hand out a lot of business cards and I had to meet X number of people. And I'm actually an introvert, so it's kind of hard for me to do all that. But one day I was reading a book called Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi. And I mentioned that in the course, or multiple courses actually. And anyways, in Never Eat Alone, I started to understand that networking wasn't necessarily about numbers. It was actually about one-on-one individual relationships. And as an introvert, I don't have a problem with one-on-one individual relationships. I actually like people. I like to learn about them and figure out how I can help them. And I started to change my idea on what networking really was. Instead of this high quantity thing, it became much more of a quality thing. And it's interesting that when I shifted my own strategy, things actually started to fall into place. I wasn't on this superficial level with a lot of people. I was on a deeper level with a smaller number of people, but the deeper level is where I started seeing some results. The other thing in the job search that I think is really important is what we used to call reputation, how people perceived us and what they thought of us and how they would talk about us. The buzzword for the last 10 years or so has been personal brand. I know some people have had a hard time with with the phrase personal brand. But whether you want to call it reputation or personal brand, the idea is who knows what about you. And so let me just introduce this really cool concept called the hidden job market. And there are books on this and seminars and stuff, but the hidden job market is simply this. You're sitting at your cubicle or in your office, and somebody comes to you, your boss maybe, and says, hey, we just got approved for 2 new positions. Nobody knows about this yet. Who do you recommend? That's it. That's the hidden job market. So as a job seeker, what we want to do is have that person who is in that conversation say, oh my gosh, I know Jason Alba, you need to go talk to him. Well, that's only going to happen if people have know me and they know something about me and they feel comfortable recommending me. That all goes back to networking, our relationships, our personal brand. And I know it sounds like it's a little overboard to do when you're not in a job search, but I'll tell you what, my job search came out of the blue. I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't anticipating it. It just happened one day. Next thing you know, I have no job and I didn't have a network and I didn't have a brand, and it took me a while to figure all that stuff out. The drum I like to beat is to tell people, you need to work on this right now. Start working on it right now. And it doesn't mean you have to be a crazy networking fool that goes to everything. And it doesn't mean that you have to try and shake everybody's hands and all that stuff. But just start developing relationships and think about how you want people to perceive who you are. Those two things together, as you work on those two things daily or weekly or monthly, you're getting closer and closer to being a part of the hidden job market before you need to look for a job.
So job seeking skills are really a little bit like an insurance policy. You don't want to wait until the house is burning down before you go buy one.
Yeah, absolutely. And nowadays there's a lot of houses that are burning down. And I'll tell you what, Don, here's the thing. I know a lot of people are listening to this thinking, I'm expert in this, I'm really good at that. But I'll tell you what, there were tens of thousands of people who were expert at Enron or Enron suppliers. And
That's
overnight, outside of their control, regardless of how great the economy was or how good the company was doing, everything just dried up. And I've seen different situations. The people that come to me and that come to my website for job search help ranges from CXO level, almost owners of companies. I actually have talked to some owners of companies that had legal problems, so they weren't able to own their company anymore, all the way down to the very bottom. There is a host of reasons that are outside of our control that might cause us to go look for a new job. And it's a lot more fun when you have your brand and your relationships than when you don't have that.
So you mentioned your website. What is that website, and is that where people should go if they want to find you online, or is it Twitter or something else for you?
So jibberjobber.com. Sounds like jibber jabber, but it's jibberjobber.com. And it's an organizer for an online organizer for your job search. And that's really the main place. I am on Twitter. I don't check it very often, but jibberjobber.com and Jason at jibberjobber.com is the main contact.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time to be with us. Hopefully giving people a little bit of room for thought and maybe some new courses to watch using their Pluralsight subscription.
Thank you.
Joining me now is Pluralsight author Tim Warner. Tim has just finished an epic redo of all of the CompTIA A+ training materials, which we released toward the end of 2015, December 2015, really to correspond with the new version of the A+ exam that everyone will start taking in January 2016. Tim, welcome to the show. And I guess it's probably reasonable to say that a lot of our listeners haven't looked at a CompTIA exam for a long time. So tell us a little bit about what's on the A+ these days. What is it still, plugging in RS-232 cables?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Don. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm grateful to report that in this latest iteration of the A+, CompTIA has done a really good job of removing obsolete technology. You're absolutely right. For far too long, those who took the A+ needed to know IRQ values long after that became completely irrelevant.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah, absolutely. And we'll speak more of the details, I'm sure, as we go along. But we're talking about contemporary hardware and software, fortunately.
So, this is something that, if somebody listening maybe has a friend or even a child who's getting to the age where they can start thinking about a career, this is kind of a legit thing for them to be looking at now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, historically, I've been in the industry since 1997, and normally, in my experience, the CompTIA A plus and or the Network Plus represent the entry level for somebody who wants to make sure they have a baseline set of skills that they can apply in IT. And A plus, I think, is particularly attractive to folks who have some background with tinkering, because who doesn't like to take a screwdriver in hand and horse around with computer hardware?
Yeah, we just don't get to do that much anymore, do we?
Right, exactly. And that's something else that those who are studying for the new 900 series A plus exams will find. You've got, well, still you have to know all the hardware components, but we have stuff about virtualization and cloud virtual machines and so forth. So all in the name of keeping up to date in the 21st century in IT.
Now, I something interesting about this one too, about this series of training that you did. This was, how many courses did you wind up having to do because there's 2 A plus exams, and so you had to do how many courses to cover everything?
Oh boy, I think that between the 22901 hardware test and the 22902 software, it's something like 11 courses. I mapped each of those courses to a domain in the blueprint that you can and should download from CompTIA.org. CompTIA has always been very transparent about the objectives on their blueprints. But I haven't totaled the number of hours in a while, but it's dozens of hours of training, let's put it that way. It's a marathon journey for the cert candidate.
And an important feature is, as you and I record this, I'm not exactly sure of the status because Pluralsight's working on some website related stuff to make it happen. But our intent is to actually make all of this A plus education free for the life of this version of the A plus exam, which should be roughly 3 years. So, if you're listening to this and you know somebody who wants to get into the field, as Tim said, the A plus is a great entry point. This is not going to cost them anything. They don't have to use your login. They can make their own login. They're going to be able to get in and get that for free, which I think is kind of a tremendous thing. We really do want to give back. And I mean, Tim, I know you sat for close to 3 months making all of this content, and it's gonna definitely be a big thing for the kind of the world, especially people wanting to get into this industry. What do you think was either the most interesting or the most challenging bit of this to teach? I mean, I know the material can be a little bit dry sometimes, and so you kind of have to pump yourself up for it, but what were a couple of memorable topics?
Well, as a trainer, I've taught A+ over the years a lot in the classroom. So teaching this Pluralsight learning path, especially for the 22901 hardware material, it took a different paradigm shift because, of course, I'm not in a room physically with the students and we can't physically take down computers and swap parts directly. So I had to be a little creative. And what I've done really is 3 things. One, we recorded a series of full motion videos in which I do an actual take apart. So that will help illustrate a lot of points. Number 2, in every one of my modules, I include a supplemental links list that points the student to, well, any reference that I make during the training. The idea is that I don't want you, the student, to have to make notes unnecessarily, like long URLs and so forth. So you've got a lot of really good practical references there embedded in the training. So yeah, the hardware definitely was the most challenging to teach in this way. Software, of course, that's our bread and butter, doing software demos, so that was much easier.
What version of Windows did you use for this? I mean, I gather it's mostly Windows client based. So were you Windows 10 or Windows 8.1?
I'm pretty sure that CompTIA would have put Windows 10 on the objectives if the product had been released. But alas, the 22901 and 902 stop at Windows 8.1. They actually want you to you to go back as far as Vista, believe it or not. Anything prior to Vista, so XP and before that are just gone, disappeared. But they do specify Vista and Windows 7 and Windows 8.1.
So XP has finally disappeared. That's awesome.
Yep.
No one ever thought that would happen. So how long have I know you said you've taught A+ in the classroom. About how long have you been teaching the A+ material to people?
I would say since 1998 or so. So I've seen all of the exam versions iterate over the years, and like I said at the beginning of our talk, I'm especially kudos to CompTIA for getting rid of old RAM. We don't have to know about AGP and bus architectures that are no longer relevant. And CompTIA has really done their homework, and it's clear that they're in touch with what trends there are in computer hardware and software now in the 21st century.
So you've probably seen more than a couple of people kind of perhaps start with the A+, and then maybe go on to start building out their career and taking harder and harder courses and getting bigger and better jobs. How's that kind of feel to help someone, shoehorn their way in the door?
That's really why I teach. It's such a beautiful thing to help somebody along who maybe is starting with just some tinker interest in electronics or computer hardware. And so they study the A+, and in so doing, and working through the 901 and 902 materials, you're really going to get current with technology, with repairing consumer systems, and even some enterprise business stuff. So it's, as an instructor, that's why I do this. When I hear back from students who have gotten their first break in the industry, and then they just blossom from there, and then depending upon where their professional passions lie, they may go for additional certifications specific to a vendor. Maybe they get into routing and switching and they go down the Cisco path. Maybe they're in an area like I am here in Nashville that's heavily Microsoft-based, so they'll look at those certifications, and it just becomes an evolving, positive thing.
And, something that we run into a lot with a lot of Pluralsight courses, especially the operations courses, is it can be really just practically difficult to set up your own lab. You look at some of the stuff Greg Shields does with vSphere. He's got 5 or 6 host machines running dozens of VMs. It's complicated. We do big stuff sometimes. A+ is a little bit different. It's not just that it's entry level though, but you can hop on, Newegg or something like that, and you can put together a decent computer for $400 or $500. So the stuff people are learning, they can actually practice without a lot of investment, right?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. Absolutely, yes. I want to draw everybody's attention to the introduction courses. The first course of the 220, 901, and 902 learning paths, Jason Helmick and I, my Pluralsight colleague, or should I say our Pluralsight colleague, have a talk, and I talk a little bit more about that. The fact that it's really important not just to pick up the theory in the training, but also to get your hands-on skills. And I dare say that you don't have to even necessarily spend several $100s to get some hardware to practice on. You can ask relatives, friends, colleagues if they have any dinosaur equipment that they just have sitting in their garage and they may be willing to donate to you to experiment on. I've also, at thrift shops and yard sales, I give you a lot of advice over the course of the training on how to get your hands-on experience in as cost-effective way as possible. And that applies equally well to software. For instance, I give guidance on how to set up a virtual lab using free software, Oracle VM VirtualBox, the desktop hypervisor. Downloading Linux, of course, is free. Microsoft Evaluation Operating Systems, those are free. So between the free training and building the practice lab being essentially free, there's very little friction, it seems to me, to get going with this certification and an IT career.
Listen as you say that, what I think would be a really, really cool thing, and I might kind of start pressing this, but for whoever listens to this, if someone has a local user group and perhaps they're getting together once a month to talk about PowerShell or Windows Server or whatever, this would be a really cool thing for the user group to do to kind of give a little back to their own community. A lot of people have kids, obviously. A lot of them are going to be at an age where they could sit through this training. Say, look, the training's free. Go tell your friends at school. They can sign on. They can watch this. And then in a couple of months, after you've had time to maybe go through the hardware thing, we're going to let all you kids come to our user group meeting, and we're all going to have a big hardware workshop. And just how much fun would that be? Is that something that you think user groups would kind of get behind?
100%. I want to encourage all of those who are listening to pop open your web browser if it's not already open and do a search for user group space your city and see how well connected the community is. And I hope that it is. Here in Nashville, Tennessee, it's pretty amazing how many user groups there are. And like you said, Don, that is a fantastic opportunity to get with community, real live people, to work on this stuff together. I mean, some people who are new to computer-based learning, like we have at Pluralsight, there's a little bit of a learning curve. If you're accustomed to, for instance, being in a classroom physically, it's a little bit of a paradigm shift to be learning via our videos. So definitely being involved with technology user groups where you live. And also, I dare say, we have community at Pluralsight. I mention this in the training a lot, but please know that we have for every one of our courses a discussion forum devoted to the course. And I myself get pinged, my email gets pinged every time a student submits something to one of my courses. So I'll respond to you immediately if you have any questions or if you want to share your experience or whatever.
So let's assume somebody sits and they go through all this. They get some hardware. They get Windows installed. They spend some time playing with it, and they really feel they've got the A plus under their in their grip, and they're ready to take the test. Now, test taking, especially for younger folks who are just tested constantly in school, what are some tips that you could offer to kind of calm your nerves and get yourself in the right frame of mind to actually take those exams?
Mm-hmm. One thing that immediately springs to mind is breathe. I've had students, who just are like, okay, I'm ready, I'm champing at the bit, and they'll register both exams for the same day. Now, I guess it really depends upon the individual's personality, but I might recommend at least putting a day between the two exams because the time limit is approximately 100 minutes, about 100 items with 100 minutes. So a minute an item, and not all the questions are multiple choice. CompTIA has turned to performance-based items over the last few years. So you'll have maybe a simulated Windows 8 desktop, and you may be asked, for instance, to configure a static IP address for a workstation, this kind of stuff. So I would say breathe. I would say invest in practice exam software if you're not accustomed to taking computer-based tests, because that's another surprise that I've seen some students have who are new to computer-based testing. They're maybe familiar with the old, I had, and you probably did too, Don, those old Scantron paper forms back in grade school.
Oh, yeah, with the bubbles. Yeah.
It's a different thing when you're sitting at a computer screen. So I know we're building out our assessment stuff to a huge degree, and I think that those skills are really crucial because, let's face it, most IT certification exams are computer-based.
Well, and the A plus is likely to be the first exam you take in your career, but it is very unlikely to be the last one. What do you think is probably a good next step for somebody once they've conquered the A plus? What kind of directions could they maybe go?
What I've seen a lot of newly certified A plus candidates do is they wind up working at a business performing warranty repairs on the company's own equipment. And in that case, depending upon who the original equipment manufacturer is, the person may be required to certify as, say, a Dell authorized technician or an Apple certified technician. So the vendor OEM certifications are one possibility. On the other hand, if the person winds up in a Best Buy or a mom and pop repair shop just doing a lot of residential commercial work, the person may decide that they just don't need it. You, of course, have to weigh the return on investment with certification. And then, like I said earlier, depending upon the person's own interests, I remember when I was first certified as an A-plus tech, I loved the hardware and I loved Windows, so it was a natural fit for me to start deep diving more into Windows, and then that kind of got me into Ethernet networking and got me into Windows Server, and then I earned the MCSE in Windows NT4. So I would strongly encourage A-plus holders to just let their interests and their professional passions and what they're doing professionally dictate what the next cert is. And certainly our library is huge enough to accommodate them in that journey.
And, just listening to what you said there, I had never really thought of, so some background. I took my A plus when I was really already working as a network technician. I had never heard of the CompTIA stuff before. I already had my MCSE, and the company I was with was really encouraging everybody to kind of backfill and get their base level certifications. And so I took the A plus back then. So I guess it never really occurred to me that when you take the A plus, there's actually job opportunities. And you mentioned like a mom and pop repair shop or maybe working for Geek Squad. I'm thinking that you could maybe look for managed service providers, MSPs in your area who might really, what are some other jobs that a young person who just got their A plus might be suitable for? So just so kind of people have some idea of what's out there.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned MSPs because that's certainly a big deal here in Nashville specifically. I have lots of friends who work for managed service providers. Some of them do all of their support with their customers remotely, just remoting into servers and sometimes employee user computers. But MSPs are just as willing to have you go on site around the city that you're in or your geographic area. That's actually a really good point to bring out. Because the A plus has been ISO certified for a number of years, the A plus will actually qualify you for jobs that otherwise may be outside your reach experience-wise, like government contract positions. They'll often require the A plus because the A plus is really, truly worldwide an industry standard credential. So government, military, we have a big military base near us, Fort Campbell, and I have some friends who have contracted with them over the years, and certainly their A plus and Network Plus credentials have helped them along those lines. In the end, there's lots of technology job sites. Again, I encourage those listening to pop open that web browser. It actually should be open by now, right? And go to technology job boards and do a search for CompTIA, do a search for A plus or Network Plus, and see what you find.
So you mentioned ISO certified. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess the A plus is matured enough as a credential. And because CompTIA is always focused on vendor neutrality rather than cleaving to a particular vendor and their proprietary stuff, that they actually worked with the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and are certified. I don't know a whole lot about ISO certifications, but A plus is ISO 17024. So put that in your web browser if you want to know more about it.
And see what that means.
Yeah, but the long and the short of it means, as I said a couple minutes ago, is that it does in fact give additional oomph or additional credibility to your certification and the jobs that you'd qualify for.
Well, that's fantastic news. Tim, congratulations on finishing the series.
Thanks.
Thanks for spending some time with us and helping people understand what this is all about. We'll keep an eye out for whatever's next from you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
And now it's my turn. I was speaking to a user group not too long ago, and we were discussing Windows PowerShell's desired state configuration. Now, if you don't care about that technology, that's fine. This is still applicable. Several people in the audience kind of shrugged and said, "This stuff sounds cool, but I'll never get to use it at my company, so it doesn't really matter to me." That statement and the attitude behind it just infuriates me. If you're not excited by learning new things just because they're cool and fun to play with, why the heck are you in IT? Is it because someone told you that you could make a lot of money if you got your MCSZYX? Who cares what your company does? If something's cool sounding, why not play with it? Look, let's start by getting a couple of things straight. First up is your job. This is the thing you go to most days of the week and get paid for. You have to know the stuff that the job needs and nothing more. The job, in some cases, is happy if you never learn anything new. Some jobs are a lot more demanding, obviously, but whatever. It's the job. Next up is your career. This is a different thing. It isn't owned by your employer, it's owned by you. Your career doesn't make you any money at all, not one dime. But your career is there for you when you need a job. If you get sick of your current job, or you get laid off, or a better opportunity comes along, it's your career that fills out your resume, gets you the interview, and lands you some paying work. If you're confronted by a technology, tool, or technique that's obviously important, obviously game-changing, and obviously cool, then it's your career that needs to be learning about it and playing with it, even if your job doesn't. You may have a job that doesn't require a lot of care or feeding, but your career is always hungry and it needs your attention. What if your current company wakes up one day, confronts reality, and realizes that they need to implement some new, for them, technology? What if their requirements shift drastically, such that your job now requires you to know those things? You've just put yourself at risk by having not kept up. But if you'd been feeding your career all along, then you'd be ready to step up, solve the problem, and ask for a raise. Look, I know it's hard to keep up, both from a pure education perspective and from a getting to play with it perspective. It's easier for developers, right? Any decently powered machine can run just about anything they need. But for us ops people, labs can be a serious financial expense. In my job as a curriculum director for Pluralsight, I really don't need to have a deep level of technical expertise. It's more of a high-level job. But does that mean I'm bowing out of having deep technical expertise? Heck no. Here's what I do in 2 easy steps, in case it can help you. Step 1, I learn constantly, but only for an hour or so a day. I read a few blogs, I watch a few education videos by authors that I respect and trust, and that helps me keep up at a high level. And it shows me where to dedicate my deep dive time. That time comes during lunch and sometimes in the evenings, or on a plane or a train. It's when I'm reading books, because I'm old-fashioned, or watching videos. Step 2, I build a lab. I used to use cloudshare.com for a lot of stuff because it's incredibly easy and it costs about $1,000 a year for essentially unlimited use of a whole bunch of lab VMs that I can set up any way I want. Yeah, that's not cheap, and no, my employer did not pay for it. But I think of it as the grocery bill for my career's hunger. I also have an on-prem lab that I'm using more and more these days. My latest iteration is a $400 Gigabyte Bricks ultra-compact PC. It has terrible graphics, and I don't care because I never even have a monitor attached. It's just a virtualization host. It's got an SSD drive, which is speedy enough for my needs, and about 32 gigs of RAM, which lets me run a whole bunch of VMs at once. I think the whole kit ran well under $1,000, so it basically paid for itself since it replaced cloudshare.com. So the point is that it shouldn't matter what you do on the job. Think about your career. Feed it. Nurture it. And if you start to think that your career is way too big to fit in your current job, well, then it's time to have some talks and make some decisions, isn't it? You're going to start seeing some marketing campaigns coming out of Pluralsight around the idea of smarter than yesterday. And I want you to take that to heart. Learn a little bit every day. And if you don't have a Pluralsight subscription or something like it, I want you to consider one. Last I looked, a personal subscription costs about $300 a year. If you're making $80,000 in your job, that's less than 0.5% of your salary to make sure you'll still have a job in 5 years or if something happens to your current job. This is your career you're playing with. Don't bemoan what you can or can't do in your current job. Stay focused on your career. Of course, that's just my perspective. I hope you'll share yours, and you can reach me on Twitter @ConcentratedDon. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our guests for their comments, and I'll see you again next month.